The 19th century, a time known for the Civil War. But this is the story of one slave-born woman who bought her freedom. This was Elizabeth Keckley. After she bought her freedom, Madame Elizabeth moved to Washington, D.C. to start her own business. She took her talent and made a life of her own. Madame Elizabeth was a skilled dressmaker for the Washington elite. She worked for everybody and anybody who had a powerful husband. Her first patron that became a friend was Mrs. Verena Davis, who had to move away from Washington City at the start of the Civil War when her husband became the President of the Confederate States. With Mrs. Davis moving out of Washington City, Madame Elizabeth had the availability for a new, high-powered patron. This time, it was the First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln. This is a story of the evolving relationship between Madame Elizabeth and Mrs. Lincoln. Madame Elizabeth became Mrs. Lincoln's closest confidant. Madame Elizabeth, in effect, became part of the Lincoln family, witnessing many private moments between the President and Mrs. Lincoln while she was sewing at the White House. Madame Elizabeth also helped Mrs. Lincoln get through all of the tragedies in her life, including the assassination of her husband. After the assassination, when Mrs. Lincoln moved to Illinois, Madame Elizabeth moved with her. Shortly after this, she moved back to Washington City, revived her dressmaking business, and then Mrs. Lincoln called on her to move again, but this time to New York City. The two of them had a quest to accomplish for Mrs. Lincoln while they were there. Before this plan was completed, Mrs. Lincoln moved back to Chicago and left Madame Elizabeth in New York to finish the job. While still in New York with little to do, Madame Elizabeth then wrote a novel about her life experiences, from growing up as a slave to becoming the dressmaker for the First Lady in an effort to improve Mrs. Lincoln's reputation. This book has changed the entire dynamic of their relationship. After the book, which was titled Behind the Scenes, was published, Madame Elizabeth had one final project for Mrs. Lincoln. Madame Elizabeth was making a quilt made entirely out of extra fabric from the dresses she had carefully sewn for Mrs. Lincoln. This book is a must-read if you liked The Widow of the South, Mrs. Lincoln's Dressmaker.